In the 90s, while the world's spotlights blazed over the most desired supermodels, there was one face that seemed unreal, almost divine. Karen Mulder, the woman with crystalline eyes and an angelic smile who walked the runway as if she were untouchable. But what happens when the perfection everyone admires becomes an invisible prison? Behind the covers of Vogue and the million-dollar contracts with the most prestigious fashion houses, Karen hid secrets the industry preferred to silence. What looked like applause and glamour to the public was, for her, a shattered mirror, depression, abuses of power, and unbearable pressure that ultimately broke her voice and her mind. Karen was an angel in the kingdom of fashion, but also a living testimony to the price of fame. Her story reveals not only the brilliance of the runway, but also the darkness that devours those who dare to inhabit it for too long. Because while the world believed she had everything, in reality, she was losing it all. And here arises the inevitable question: how could a woman who embodied absolute perfection become a symbol of the most painful fragility? In a quiet corner of the Netherlands, far from the lights of Paris, Milan, or New York, a girl was born who seemed destined for another reality. Karen Mulder came into the world in Vlaardingen in 1970, in an environment that had nothing to do with the clamor of international fashion. Her family was simple, working class, rooted in firm values and modest expectations that reached no further than a peaceful suburban life in Holland. Her childhood was defined by calm bike rides along the canals, the routine of school days, the life of a reserved, dreamy girl. Karen did not grow up surrounded by luxury or extravagant ambitions. Her parents, never imagining what fate was preparing, raised her with a mixture of tenderness and discipline. Yet even as a child, there was something about her that drew attention, a magnetic beauty, impossible to ignore even in the most ordinary of settings. At school, classmates whispered about her deep gaze, that strange serenity she seemed to carry. She was not the typical rebellious teenager. Instead, she walked with a kind of innate grace, as though she had always belonged to another world. That difference, which sometimes made her feel isolated, soon became her passport to an entirely different life. But what fascinates about Karen's beginnings is not just the story of a normal girl who became a supermodel. It is the brutal contrast between her roots and the universe where she would eventually lose herself. While her friends dreamed of steady jobs or building a family, Karen was discovered almost by accident through the lens of a camera. A single amateur photo shoot was enough to catapult her image into the sights of international scouts. Overnight, the girl from Vlaardingen was no longer just Karen. She was a raw diamond that the fashion machine was eager to polish to its limit. That sudden leap, that fracture between the calm life of Holland and the whirlwind of Paris, would forever mark the duality that defined her existence. An ice angel on the runway, a fragile soul in private. When Karen Mulder arrived in Paris, she was little more than a teenager who had never imagined the dizzying heights of international fashion. The transition was so sudden there was barely time to process it. A modeling contest, a handful of photographs, and suddenly the doors of the world's most powerful agencies swung wide open. The French capital, with its endless glow, welcomed her as a revelation. Her porcelain face, those almost hypnotic blue eyes, and that ethereal figure seemed sculpted to fit the fantasy of the great fashion houses. Karl Lagerfeld, Valentino, Yves Saint Laurent, each one saw her and knew instantly that they were looking at a phenomenon. She was the embodiment of a Nordic goddess in flesh and blood. And yet, behind that triumphant entrance, the beginning was far from simple. Paris could be magical, but it could also be merciless. At barely 18, Karen had to learn how to survive the frantic pace of endless castings, the ruthless critiques, the brutal competition where friendship rarely found space. Every gaze was an evaluation, every word a judgment on her body, her face, her very way of walking. The agencies sculpted her image with surgical precision. They taught her how to pose, how to speak to the press, how to glide down a runway as if floating on air. The Dutch girl was being transformed into a consumable product. And though her rise appeared effortless, the truth was that each step carried an invisible weight. The pressure to fit an impossible mold, the demand to be flawless at all times. But Karen's magnetism was undeniable. Within months, she was no longer just the new girl. She was walking the runways of Paris and Milan fashion weeks, appearing in prestigious magazine editorials, and weaving that aura of untouchability that would soon make her a legend. The world watched in fascination, even as within her the seed of a stormy future quietly began to grow. For the beginning of her career was also the beginning of her gilded cage, the place where she would be adored as an angel, yet slowly broken from within. At the beginning of the decade of 1990, the name Karen Mulder stopped being a whisper in the corridors of modeling agencies and became a unanimous roar on the world's most coveted runways. Her rise was so dizzying it felt unreal. In a matter of months, she went from being the new girl to becoming one of the most sought-after faces on the planet. The true turning point came when she was chosen as the face of Guess, a brand that at the time dictated global trends. Her photographs, brimming with sensuality and elegance, spread across magazines, billboards, and storefronts, cementing her as fashion's newest dream. With that campaign, Karen wasn't just selling clothes, she was selling a fantasy. Soon, the list of names clamoring for her seemed endless. Dior, Chanel, Valentino, Versace all wanted the Dutch woman with the glacial gaze. Her face graced the covers of Vogue, Elle, and Harper's Bazaar. Designers adored her because she embodied an ideal of perfection that seemed untouchable. The media adored her because she was the perfect blend of mystery and beauty. And the public adored her because she looked like an angel walking among mortals. The supermodel phenomenon was at its peak, and Karen stood firmly among that exclusive Olympus alongside Claudia Schiffer, Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, and Christy Turlington. They were the modern goddesses, commanding astronomical fees, closing advertising contracts like film stars, and provoking collective hysteria with every public appearance. But this explosion of fame carried a price. The runway lights and camera flashes never went dark. Perfection had to be maintained day and night, leaving no room for error. To the global audience, Karen Mulder was untouchable, almost celestial. To herself, each shoot, each runway, each magazine cover was slowly becoming a battle against an invisible enemy. The relentless pressure to be flawless, always. And so, while the world worshipped her, the first cracks began to open in silence. By the time she became one of the most coveted supermodels on the planet, Karen Mulder had reached a level of power few women had ever known in the industry. Her mere presence could elevate the prestige of a brand, and her advertising contracts reached astronomical figures. She walked alongside the great divas of the era, invited to private parties, surrounded by artists, designers, and millionaires. On the surface, she seemed to be living the impossible dream of any young woman who aspired to fashion. But the other side of that power was darker, almost unbearable. The fashion industry during the 1990 decade was marked by ruthless veracity. Karen's body was no longer her own. It was a canvas upon which others decided what to display and how to shape it. Agencies, photographers, editors, all exercised absolute control. Every calorie was counted. Every wrinkle scrutinized under a magnifying glass. Every gesture expected to be flawless. Behind the curtains of glamorous parties lurked a world steeped in drugs, excess, and unspoken favors. At barely 20-something, Karen found herself in an environment where the line between adoration and exploitation blurred into a dangerous haze. What magazines portrayed as paradise, for her became a labyrinth of pressures and manipulations. The young woman once discovered for her innocent beauty was now trapped in a cycle of endless demands. Sleep was scarce, travel was constant, and she had to be ready at all times for a plane, a runway, a magazine cover. The angelic smile that captivated millions concealed a growing exhaustion, a void that neither money nor applause could fill. In time, that pressure would become her greatest enemy. Because while the power she held over the runways was real, the power over her own life was slowly slipping through her fingers. While the world adored her as an untouchable angel, behind closed doors, Karen Mulder battled demons that had nothing to do with runways or magazine covers. The press often captured her alongside powerful men, businessmen, musicians, magnates. Her romances fueled headlines, but what the glossy spreads never showed were the fractures those relationships left in her emotional life. Karen sought refuge in love, perhaps a kind of anchor amid the whirlwind of her career. Yet those relationships were often marked by imbalances of power. In a world where money and fame meant everything, she herself became both a coveted trophy for some and a replaceable ornament for others. Some lovers paraded her as a symbol of status, without ever pausing to see the fragility behind her icy gaze. As the years passed, loneliness grew heavier. Away from the cameras, Karen confessed to feeling used, treated as just another commodity of the fashion machine and of the men who orbited around her. Her vulnerability was an open secret no one wanted to hear. The woman who embodied perfection before the world was crumbling in private. Rumors of turbulent affairs, painful breakups, and broken promises intertwined with an increasingly suffocating shadow: depression. The once inexhaustible radiance that defined her began to fade. Friendships, too, bore the weight of her spiral. Karen became withdrawn, distant, caught between the desperate need to be loved and the paralyzing fear of being hurt again. Her personal tragedies did not always make it into headlines, but they accumulated quietly, layer by layer. It was as if each heartbreak left another shadow cast upon the perfection the world so worshipped. The angel of fashion was beginning to realize her wings were made of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest blow. The radiance that had surrounded Karen Mulder for a decade began to fade abruptly. The supermodel who had once embodied perfection started to show visible cracks of fragility. What began as whispers in the corridors of fashion soon exploded into a media spectacle: the fall of an angel. At the beginning of the decade of 2000, Karen shocked the world with harrowing revelations. In televised interviews and press conferences, she spoke openly about sexual abuse she had endured throughout her career, even accusing figures of immense power. But instead of receiving empathy or the support she desperately needed, her words were met with suspicion. Many in the press labeled her unstable, colleagues remained silent, and the very industry that had once idolized her turned its back. That public rupture was devastating. The woman who had graced the cover of Vogue now appeared in tabloids under sensational headlines, questioning her sanity. Her voice, raised at last against the abuses of the system, was silenced with a single word: madness. The weight of public humiliation pushed her toward an emotional abyss that seemed impossible to escape. Karen suffered nervous breakdowns that led to hospitalizations. Her private life became a battlefield, torn between her need to be heard and the indifference of a world that preferred to keep her quiet. Paparazzi no longer chased her to capture her beauty, but to exploit her vulnerability, documenting every tremor, every fragile step. It was the moment when the untouchable goddess shattered before the entire world. The ice angel who once floated across the most glamorous runways was now a wounded woman, exposed, stigmatized, and utterly alone. What many consumed as morbid spectacle was, for her, the beginning of a personal hell. After the media scandal and the forced hospitalizations, Karen Mulder vanished from the public radar. The woman who had once been omnipresent in global campaigns and international runways faded into an uncanny silence, almost spectral. For many, it was as if she had fallen into a black hole from which there was no return. This withdrawal was not a calculated marketing move, nor a transition to another phase of her career. It was instead a desperate escape. Karen needed to flee the deafening noise that surrounded her. The photographers hunting for images of her downfall, the media questioning her sanity, the voices of the industry that preferred to erase her name. In those dark years, she tried to rebuild herself far from the catwalks. There were attempts to reclaim control of her life through therapy, through writing, even through music, an effort to give voice to what she had long kept locked away. Her voice, once silenced and ridiculed, sought expression in another art form. Yet every attempt at rebirth was overshadowed by the weight of her past. The press refused to see her as an emerging artist. Instead, she was reduced to a headline: "The Fallen Supermodel." Karen's mental and emotional fragility remained a colossal obstacle. The public, accustomed to viewing her as an unattainable ideal, struggled to accept the real woman scarred, uncertain, vulnerable. The chasm between the goddess she once was and the wounded soul fighting to survive became the defining dilemma of her existence. And yet, amid this self-imposed exile, Karen revealed glimpses of what she truly sought. It was not a return to the runways, nor the recovery of million-dollar contracts. What she longed for was something far simpler, yet seemingly unattainable: peace. To live without the crushing weight of judgment, without the endless demand for perfection, to be recognized not for her ethereal beauty, but for her humanity. Her disappearance from the grand stage was, in truth, her own act of resistance, a gesture of survival. Although her career ended abruptly, the impact of Karen Mulder remains an indelible mark in the history of fashion. She was part of that golden generation that defined the very concept of the supermodel. Women who did not merely walk the runway but commanded popular culture with the same force as movie stars or royalty. Karen was, without exaggeration, an archetype of beauty from the 1990 decade. An angelic face, a distant aura, and an elegance that seemed impossible to imitate. Her legacy does not lie solely in the covers and campaigns she starred in, though those images still circulate today as aesthetic references in contemporary editorials. It also resides in what she represented for the industry. The woman transformed into an absolute ideal, the canon that countless models tried to reach afterward, but never fully achieved. The Mulder gaze, that cold, almost inhuman expression, yet magnetic and hypnotic, became a signature that defined an entire era. But alongside beauty, Karen left another legacy far more uncomfortable, though necessary. Her public breakdown, her accusations, her fall, all brutally exposed fashion's darkest side: exploitation, abuse of power, the psychological pressures that drag so many young women into depression and self-destruction. If the fashion industry of the 1990 decade preferred silence, Karen's fractured voice became, with time, a prescient testimony, an echo that now resonates louder in conversations about consent, mental health, and the responsibility of agencies. In many ways, Karen Mulder embodies the duality of fashion itself: splendor and decay, perfection and fragility, goddess and woman. Her presence on the runway left an aesthetic legacy. Her downfall left an unforgettable warning. And together, those two faces made her a figure impossible to erase. To speak of Karen Mulder today is to speak of a myth with two faces. On one side remains the visual memory of the supermodel of the decade of 1990, the woman who commanded the runway with glacial elegance, the muse of haute couture houses, the face that embodied the fantasy of perfection. Her images still circulate across social media, on accounts dedicated to fashion nostalgia, and in compilations that recall the supermodels as the untouchable goddesses of an unrepeatable era. In that collective imagination, Karen endures as an angel of untouchable beauty. But the other face is that of a woman who dared to challenge the official narrative of the industry. Karen spoke of abuses when no one wanted to listen, denounced what many preferred to hide, and broke down in front of cameras at a time when mental health was an absolute taboo. That courage, though it cost her reputation, then takes on new meaning today. In an era when revelations have shaken film, music, and fashion alike, Karen's words sound prophetic. She was a solitary voice that foreshadowed a global reckoning. That is why, as a cultural icon, Karen Mulder is not limited to representing the aesthetics of the decade of 1990. She also represents the fragility hidden beneath the spotlight, the brutal price of perfection, and the importance of recognizing humanity in those whom fame turns into symbols. Her story is cited in documentaries, articles, and essays as an example of how fashion can elevate someone to Olympus and at the same time destroy them mercilessly. In popular culture, Karen is remembered both as a warning and as an inspiration. A warning about the excesses and complicit silences of the industry. An inspiration for those who, despite having fallen, dared to speak their truth. Karen Mulder was an ice angel, dressed in perfection by the industry and adored by the world without question. But behind that goddess-like face lived a real woman, fragile, marked by invisible wounds. Her story is not one of flawless triumph, but of a meteoric rise followed by a brutal fall. And yet, it is precisely in that fall where her most powerful truth resides. Because Karen did not only show us beauty, she forced us to confront the cost of that beauty. She taught us that behind every immaculate photograph there can be an internal battle, that fame can illuminate as much as it can destroy, and that the voice of a woman silenced in her time can echo eternally in generations to come. Today, Karen Mulder remains an enigma, the supermodel who embodied an unattainable ideal and the woman who dared to shatter it. Her legacy does not lie in having been perfect, but in revealing that perfection is, in truth, a prison. And her name, once used to sell clothes and dreams, now survives as a cultural symbol of warning and resistance. The final question is not how beautiful she was or how many covers she graced. The real question is, what are we willing to sacrifice in the name of glamour? The story of Karen Mulder makes it clear that the answer may be far too dark. And perhaps that is why her figure continues to fascinate. Because Karen Mulder was not just a supermodel. She was living proof that even angels can fall, and that their fall can be more revealing than any triumphant runway.